The college football playoff might be changing in 2026, and that'd be good for Oregon. I just wouldn't like it.
You are Locked On Ducks, your daily podcast on the Oregon Ducks. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, it is that time once again for Locked On Ducks. I'm your host, Spencer McLaughlin. Thank you so much for making this your first listen or your first view of the day, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day and your number one source to stay up to date with the Ducks. We've got lots to get to today. Can Oregon's rushing attack actually be better this year? Yeah, I think it can for a couple of reasons, not just Makhi Hughes, and a couple of nuggets on the tight end position for the class of 2026, where Oregon is getting ready to load up. But first, Ross Dellenger of Yahoo Sports reports, and if you're not following him on Twitter and you're a college football fan, you're kind of doing it wrong. He's got a bunch of great information out there. But there are conversations ongoing this week between the Big Ten and the SEC, who essentially control the college football playoff. Not really even essentially. They just control whatever happens with the playoffs starting in 2026. And the reported format they are going to examine has not been passed, but they are examining a 4-4-2-2-1-1 format. What does that mean exactly? 4 automatic bids to the playoff from the Big Ten, 4 automatic bids to the playoff from the SEC, 2 from the ACC, 2 from the Big 12, 1 from the Group of 5, the good old Pac-12, at least that's what the league is now. I don't know what it would have been had the Pac-12 stuck together, but I won't deal in hypotheticals today. And then 1 at-large spot that is essentially reserved for Notre Dame. So this would be really good for Oregon on the one hand, because what every college football season would then turn into is a slightly different and slightly more urgent version of what the NFL really is, which is, if you just go out and beat all the teams that you are supposed to, who aren't any good and are not on the same caliber of roster as you, you're getting in the playoffs. And guess what? That's what my Seahawks had this past year. They missed the playoffs by 1 game. They were tied with the Rams but they went 10-7. You know the game that cost them? They lost to the Giants. The Giants at home. They lost to the Giants at home. That's why they didn't make it. So if this format were to get approved, Oregon going into every single year, and I have said several times and continue to believe that I expect Oregon to be in the playoff every year as a baseline standard of success. The financial investment is there. The way they can acquire talent and have acquired talent to lay a foundation for the coming years as well. The transfer portals there, like everything is in place for Oregon to be able to do that. No questions asked. If they don't do it, that's a failed season. If they go 9-3 this year and miss the 12-team playoff, that's a failure of a season. But if they go 10-2 and get in, anything could happen. But at least I'd like to think anything could happen. But for Oregon, if they get 4 auto bids in the Big Ten, what's the value of the Big Ten championship game? And heck, Oregon fans are probably asking themselves that question right now. I'm asking myself that question. That was one of my incorrect takes from last year. I said going into it, yeah, Oregon wants to win the Big Ten. You want the bye. You want the teams that had a bye went 0-4. They didn't get a home playoff game against a team who they were highly favored against. Yeah, they didn't get that. And if they had, it might have been a different postseason. So I'm not really sure how that structure works into it. But if the Big Ten has 4 auto bids, you're talking about 9-3 in certain years is going to get you in. If you looked at Oregon's schedule this season, which is incredibly favorable, 10-2 would get you in, 9-3 might get you in. Because if the Big Ten winds up with 4 automatic bids to the playoff, how often do you have 4 teams that are capable of winning 10 or more games? Now in an 18-team conference, that's more feasible than it used to be because of how the schedules work out. Not everybody's playing everybody. Okay. But I mean, this year in the Big Ten, your automatic bids would have been Oregon and Penn State playing in the conference championship game, and then Indiana and Ohio State. Those are the teams with the best records in the Big Ten. Ohio State went 10-2, upset by Michigan, they would have automatically been in. They were automatically in this past year. But this would be an expansion and further solidification of the decision made by Oregon to join the Big Ten of being the right move, whether you like it or not, which I don't. Wish it could have been how it was. I grew up with the Pac-12. I loved the Pac-12, and the geography doesn't make a whole heck of a lot of sense, but lo and behold, here we are. But that path to the playoff would only get easier. So why did I say in my open to this show that it might not all be good? Because suddenly the big games that Oregon plays aren't going to matter as much. They're not. They already mean less than they used to. What was the actual value, now that we've seen how the postseason played out, of Ohio State losing to Oregon? Not of Oregon winning. The benefit of Oregon winning that game is still significant, but certainly lessened because of the postseason structure that we now have. You're going to go into any given year. Oregon's 2026 schedule in Big Ten play has Ohio State and Michigan on it. If that's a 14-team playoff with a couple of auto bids, sure, you want to win those games because it's fun, but guess what? There's no real juice if you lose. Some people might like that because it can be incredibly stressful to go into a Saturday knowing Oregon has to win, or they might not make the playoff, or they might not make the conference championship game, or might not do this or that. But if every year it's just going to be, hey, you got to be able to beat Oregon State, Washington, and 7 other Big Ten teams, 8 other Big Ten teams. Yeah, you got to beat Oregon State and Washington, and sure, I can envision a year in which Oregon plays Ohio State, Michigan, and Washington and loses all 3. That's not out of the realm of possibility. But going into each year, I don't want, and this is just my perspective, maybe everybody doesn't share this. Let me know in the comments below. But I like when big regular season games mean something for college football. I love that as a college football fan. And as someone who talks about it every day over on Locked On College Football, but I love it as an Oregon fan too. Anyone who was at Autzen Stadium the night of October 12th against the Buckeyes this past year, I imagine that was one of the most unforgettable days of your entire life. One of the greatest feelings, one of the greatest games. You don't have the same level of stakes. The importance isn't the same. So that high-end payoff in regular season games emotionally, it's not going to be there. It's not going to be there. So that's why I think it stinks, is that the automatic bids, yeah, helps Oregon get into the playoff. That's great. And for those of us, was that a Freudian slip to say us? I don't know, maybe. But I meant to say for those of you that are only defining success as does Oregon win the national championship in a given season, this is for you. This would be the ideal situation for you, because the regular season takes a back seat as long as you win all the games that you're supposed to. And sure, you still got to go out and win those games, and everybody else is putting money into their programs and trying to win football games, recruiting talented kids. They're doing all that stuff too. But I do not want the playoff expanded further, even though, yeah, it's great for Oregon. But those big games on the schedule, it's not going to feel the same. It is not going to feel the same if they expand it further, but it'd be good for the Ducks. So at least there's that, right? I got one hand over here, one hand over there. Let me know what you think below, or hit me up on Twitter. Either one. Always love hearing your guys' thoughts. I have thoughts on Oregon's rushing attack. It needs to be better, and I think it can. You can do your taxes better with Intuit TurboTax. Taxes was, past tense, dealing with piles of paperwork and frustrating forms, and then waiting and wondering and worrying if you were going to get any money back. Now, taxes is, present tense, easily uploading your forms to a TurboTax expert who's matched to your unique tax situation, an expert who's backed by the latest technology, which cross-checks millions of data points for 100% accuracy. While they work on your taxes, you get real-time updates on their progress. And you get the most money back guaranteed, all while you just go about your day. No stressing, no worrying, no waiting. Now this is taxes. Intuit TurboTax. Get an expert now on TurboTax.com. Only available with TurboTax Live Full Service. Real-time updates only in iOS mobile apps. See guarantee details at TurboTax.com/guarantees. TurboTax.com. Second segment sips, always there, even when you don't see them. So, You want to hear a crazy stat about Oregon's running game? In each year subsequently, while Dan Lanning has remained the head coach in Eugene, the rushing output has gotten worse on a team-wide basis. Now, Oregon has had a 1,000-yard rusher each season. It was Bucky Irving in 2023. Pretty sure Bucky just got there in 2022. And then Jordan James this past year had just under 1,200 yards to go with 15 touchdowns. He was really good. But the overall productivity of Oregon's rushing attack can take a big step forward. Now, part of this, I do think, is due to the hire of Will Stein, who I am not going to sit here and dog on for the next 8 minutes, because I think Will Stein's really good. The list of coordinators, not just in the last 5 years, but ever in college football, that have produced back-to-back Heisman Trophy finalists at the quarterback spot, that list is incredibly small, and Will Stein has accomplished that. But what we have seen is a pullback in the rushing game, and I think that's a byproduct of Will Stein's RPO-heavy attack. When you have a lot of RPOs, you give the quarterback the ability to not hand the ball off, whereas other teams might just go with a straight handoff. That's what a team like Michigan would do, or that's what a team like Georgia Tech would do, for instance. They're not going to necessarily build in a ton of options to a play. They're just going to line up. Old school Stanford was like this as well. They're just going to line up and run the football. So Jordan James this past year ran for 1,184 yards, 5.4 yards a carry, and 15 touchdowns. Oregon's rushing yards per game from 2022 to now has gone from 216 per game in 2022 with Kenny Dillingham to 184 to 152. And this was something I touched on throughout the course of the season a couple of times, because I kept noticing, boy, they really didn't run the ball. There weren't as many games where you felt like Oregon controlled the game on the ground, or where they were as explosive on the ground. I mean, heck, Jordan James didn't have a carry of, I think it was more than 20 yards until his first or second touch in the Michigan State game. The Michigan State, that was game 5. That was the first time that Jordan James ran the ball for, it was either 15 or 20 yards. But anyway, what they categorized as an explosive. And Jason Benetti, who was the announcer on that game, who's phenomenal as a play-by-play guy, by the way, he made a point of it as he was making the run. For the first time this season, he finally breaks free. So it hasn't been a hallmark of this offense. Now you insert Makhi Hughes, who's in his 3rd year of college football, comes over from Tulane via the portal, and this past year at Tulane in the American Conference, which is this past year, I'd say probably the second best Group of 5 league in the country. So I think he's going to go against certainly a higher level of competition in the Big Ten, no doubt. I don't think it's the same sort of jump that some guys have tried to make going from the MAC to the Big Ten. But then again, Curtis Rourke did that at quarterback for Indiana, and that worked out pretty darn well. But Hughes was over 1,400 yards this year, 5.3 yards a carry to James' 5.4, also ran for 15 touchdowns. Now, these two guys have some similarities. Their build is pretty similar. They're both under 6 feet tall, well-built, physical runners, but Makhi Hughes has a little bit more wiggle in his game, and I think a little bit more explosion in his game as well. So when you watch him run, if you go on YouTube, maybe as you're listening to this show, or after you listen to or watch this show, if you YouTube his highlights, you'll see plenty of explosive run plays in there. If you were to YouTube Jordan James highlights, you wouldn't see a bunch of 40, 50, 30-yard runs that were broken for long touchdowns. You know what you'd see? He runs through guys' faces. The Michigan State game, when he was dominant in the first half, he was running over defensive backs left and right and trucked a guy in the first quarter, I think it was, that made you go, "Whew, boy." He did it against Washington as well. To a guy, I'm pretty sure he did it to Ephesians Prysock. I might be remembering that player incorrectly, but got to the perimeter. Here comes a corner. You're going to lose, buddy. That's what Jordan James was. Hughes has that ability, but he also has that second gear. So I was thinking about this because I got a question from DWC Sports, and you can always submit mailbag questions, YouTube comments, Twitter, or become a Locked On Ducks insider as well. Link in the description below. You can get a free 14-day trial, priority access, and a bunch of other perks as well with regards to the mailbag. DWC Sports sent this one in saying, mailbag question, what are your expectations for the Oregon running back room this year? Does Whittington make a big jump? So, no, on Whittington. I don't expect him to. I think Noah Whittington is pretty well established at this point. I mean, he's going into, amazingly, his 4th season as a Duck. Wild to think about, right? But he came over, I believe, as a redshirt freshman in 2022, played that season, but then in 23, got cut short against Colorado due to injury. So I think he got a medical redshirt, played in 24, and now he's back for 2025. So Hughes is going to be the number one guy. That's my expectation. Whittington will have the same sort of role. I do wonder, though, if more guys get involved. You go back to that 2022 season, again, different offensive coordinator, but obviously the same head coach with Dan Lanning there. Oregon used 4 running backs regularly. They had clearly defined roles throughout the season. I think a couple guys maybe faded a bit as it went on, but we saw Bucky Irving that year. We saw Noah Whittington that year. We saw Jordan James as a short line yardage guy. And Sean Dollars was in there in certain packages as well, and as a pass catcher. So I wonder if more than 2 guys aren't involved this year. Jaden Lamar has got a season or 2. I forget which class he was a part of exactly. But, you know, he's been the number 3 back, or he was the number 3 back this past year. He's solid. I don't think he's anything special, but he's solid, capable. But what happens with Dink Riggs? What happens with Jay Harris? We only saw glimpses of those 2 guys in mop-up duty this year, but they showed me a lot more than Jaden Lamar did. But are they ready to take on a primary role in the offense? And Whittington, who, of course, has gotten hurt once before in his career, if he goes down, is it Jaden Lamar? When Jordan James went down in the Rose Bowl, it was Lamar who stepped in. But does that continue being the case? Or do they feel like they could generate more explosive plays if they incorporate more of these guys into the rushing attack? Because I think Dink Riggs, you know, famously on the Ducks versus them, you heard one of the coaches say, Little Bucky. That's what he looked like. He's just shifting through the line, making guys miss, a lot of lateral movement, going side to side, and looking really, really capable whilst doing it. You know, it wasn't like, oh boy, he needs a lot of work there. No, he looked pretty good. Again, limited action. Coaches, of course, see a lot more than you and I do. But I think the talent in this room for Rashad Samples, a running backs coach, who remains that, with Ross Douglas getting hired from Syracuse to be the wide receivers coach, of course. I think the talent there is incredibly solid. And 152 yards a game, I think they're capable of more than that. But a running back is, of course, only as good as the offensive line. Running backs seldom get away from defensive tackles. Linebackers, a little bit easier. You get a running back on a safety, offensive coordinators and head coaches actively try to get their running backs in space one-on-one with a corner or a safety. So you only get there if your offensive line plays well. Well, this past year's unit had a lot of kind of shuffling around. You know, there was the injury to Bedford preseason. Then there was the injury to Marcus Harper that came about later in the year. Like, they were trying to find the right combination early in the season. But going into next year, I don't know if the offensive line is going to be able to perform at the same level as it did this past season. But if they settle into a groove, I think you can readily make the case. As much as I love Jordan James, I really did. And if he'd come back, I'd feel similar, I would say, to how I feel right now, which is ever so slightly on the cautious optimistic side of, hey, this running attack can be better. They can get more out of it. And I think that at some level, just because Dan Lanning's a defensive guy, this is just my suspicion. Defensive guys tend to like running the ball, physicality, culture, set the tone, control the game, all that sort of stuff. I wonder if they don't have a stronger emphasis on running the ball next year. But if your offensive line isn't able to create lanes, then none of it matters. And you lost a really, really good player, of course, in Josh Connerly, and Cornelius and Harper's gone and Strother's gone. And Strother, I thought, was really good in the run game this year. So that aspect of it is slightly more challenging. But I think from a talent standpoint in the running back room, you have the tools to get more out of that area. And remember, they struggled big time in the Rose Bowl. They can be better in that area going into 2025. Great question. Great question. Keep the questions coming as always. So, looking ahead to 2026 and the recruiting class that's there, Oregon's got one tight end committed. Really highly rated guy. Do they need two? So, there is a changing of the guard of sorts for Oregon at the tight end position. Now, the Ducks have had some great tight ends over the years, going back to guys like David Paulson or Ed Dixon. Like, just keep going. Just keep listing them all. Drop them in the comments below, because I love me some Oregon tight ends. They've had some really good ones. Farrell Brown was really good. Farrell Brown still bounces around the NFL, by the way. But what's happened in the last couple of years, and really since Lanning took over, because remember, Terrence Ferguson, who's great, and I believe will get drafted in the NFL here in the next couple of months. Terrence Ferguson was originally recruited by the Mario Cristobal staff. Well, ever since Lanning and Drew Maringer, the tight ends coach, have taken over, they've pretty consistently gone after a different profile of tight ends. Rather than being kind of blockers first who can catch, and T-Ferg wasn't necessarily that, but a guy like Patrick Herbert was, or a guy like Maliki Monteval was, who that previous staff recruited. Oregon's now going after the hyper athlete, the Kyle Pitts type, the do-it-all sort of player. That's what Kenyon Sadiq is. And I think Sadiq is in for a monster season in 2025. That potential is so there, especially because you have Jamari Johnson from Louisville as well, who's bigger, I think a little bit more blocking oriented perhaps, but he's only played one season of college football, pretty highly rated recruit coming out of high school. But I think we all know Kenyon Sadiq is tight end one. PFF actually had him graded as Oregon's best tight end in this past season. So, and I'm a huge T-Ferg fan, always have been. Sadiq's going to be really good. But I wonder if Oregon doesn't take two tight ends in this class of 2026. They're clearly trying to. So the one they already have committed, and you got to keep him that way, of course, is Kendre Harrison, who is just among the most unique athletes Oregon has ever recruited. So is Sadiq, by the way. There have not been a lot of guys that can do what Kenyon Sadiq is able to do on a football field. Line up on the end and block a defensive end, or pancake a linebacker or a DB or a defensive end, frankly. Like, he can do a lot of stuff. And he can run fly sweeps. Harrison is that sort of physical profile. But Oregon has also made it very clear they're going after Brock Harris, who's down in my neck of the woods in southern Utah. He's down in St. George, about 45 minutes away from me at Pineview High School. And he's a highly rated 4-star kid. And if Oregon brings in two tight ends, I think it's because they know two things. Number one, they're going to feature Kenyon Sadiq even more in 2025 than they did in 2024, which was a big step in production from his freshman campaign. And they probably know, number two, that if Sadiq has the sort of season he's capable of and stays healthy, he might be off to the NFL. Because his physical profile isn't like everybody else. He's a Kyle Pitts type. Now, think whatever you want of Kyle Pitts, who is just accidentally creating a bunch of great meme content on Twitter over the last couple of years. Sadiq could very easily be out of the University of Oregon after the 25 season, and then Oregon fans will be looking around going, well, who's next at tight end? Well, Jamari Johnson will be going into his third year of college football in 2026, so if he sticks around, maybe he's the number one. But Kendre Harrison, who's also a top basketball recruit, which is kind of awesome. Oregon had a great two-way guy in a really, really long time. Jonathan Lloyd was a good basketball player and was on the football roster, but didn't really play a whole heck of a lot. I think he just returned a punt one time in garbage time. But that angle of the tight end room going into next year, I think is really interesting, because you could create. I know that tight end battles are not as riveting as quarterback battles per se, but between Johnson, Harrison, and Harris or Roger Saliapaga in the mix, whether or not Oregon feels like they need to get two tight ends in the class of 2026 likely depends on whether they feel Roger Saliapaga comes back from injury and is fully healthy, back to what he was before the surgery and whatnot, and whether AJ Pugliano can develop into a contributor at that time. Because if you go 0 for 2 on those guys being able to play, well, suddenly you do need tight ends. But if you got one of them, all right, maybe you don't need two. But just something to keep an eye on, because Harrison is incredibly talented. So too is Harris. And Oregon almost brought in, a pair of tight ends in this past cycle. They ended up just bringing in Vander Plug, who I also just left out of that tight ends conversation. But if they go after both of those guys, I suspect it's because they know, all right, Sadiq's on his way out. Maybe another guy hits the transfer portal, and you want to have some options in there. But you don't always see. Oregon's only got the one tight end. They went after Lincoln Cure in 2025 and didn't get him. But they got the one tight end in 2025, and Plug could be a solid player. Maybe he's an immediate contributor. Maybe he's not. But the two tight end debate, debacle, discussion, however you want to frame it, something to keep an eye on in the class of 2026. Appreciate everyone listening. I will see you next time. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and go Ducks.